Hi, welcome to Morning Talk Show. Today, my conversation with Trevor Tchir. I contacted Trevor because he's kind of someone I know peripherally in my life, and I wanted to talk to someone who was an expert on postmodernism, like someone who would actually identify as a postmodernist. So I put it out on Facebook. He replied that he was a postmodernist. This was a long time ago. But when I actually contacted him to have a chat, he kind of revealed that he's not particularly an expert on postmodernism, that he actually is a political science professor now and is a disciple of the works of He is an appreciator inspired by the works of Hannah Arendt. And there's a sort of a postmodern slant to her writings and thinking. So I decided to talk to him anyway because I thought he would be fascinating, because politics is another thing that I would like to understand, and the idea of someone who has postmodernism in any way as part of their thinking on politics is interesting to me. So one of the things you'll notice about this video is that we don't really give a great succinct definition of postmodernism. And I can just say that from my perspective, postmodernism is a fraught term, and it's something that so many people don't directly self-identify as. And I'm of two minds on it. Like, some people will say that postmodernism is just, there's no such thing as truth. And there's no such thing as objective truth. And I think that's probably a big part of it. But a better definition I've heard is the idea that there's no specific validity in grand narratives, that grand narratives, like the big story of us, has all kinds of remainders left over, all kinds of people screwed over in the process. And so I've kind of grown to see postmodernism as a necessary movement because, as I've talked about in other podcasts, the certainty of the modern era, the certainty of religion, the certainty of scientific materialism, just the certainty of human beings has a toxicity to it. And I do think it kind of crescendoed with modernism. I'm not saying modernism created it or anything like that, but so postmodernist thinkers are people who were just recognizing, we're seeing around them the toxic properties of the way that we take the ideas of truth, codify them, systematize them, associate them and lump them in with governments or religious faiths, and all kinds of ways that we turn those into actually ways to reject the idea of new revelation, of new thinking, of change. And so we live in an interesting time because it's possible that it's possible that postmodernism has gone too far, and it's possible that we need a middle road that definitely takes a healthy dose of postmodernism and this idea that there will still be anything fresh, new, or revealed through science or through religion or through spiritual practice or whatever. So that's kind of what I'm saying and thinking when I refer to postmodernism in this conversation. I can't speak to Trevor, and I kind of didn't want to make him do, it felt a little bit weird to make him do a big comprehensive definition of it, because it's not the thing that he's been, nor is it for me, but it's not the thing that he's been engaged in defining. So Trevor has been engaged in understanding the law, understanding politics and political systems and that kind of thing, and teaching it to students. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed Trevor's perspective. I thought he was loving, intelligent, careful, and it really made me want to learn more about Hannah Arendt and more about politics, because he seemed to have a kind of human view of politics that, anyway, I'm talking too much about it. Enjoyed the conversation. I hope that you do as well. Like and subscribe if you want more of this kind of content. And also, please do comment about how I've got postmodernism right, how I've got it wrong, anything that pops into your mind, because I've really enjoyed engaging in some comments on my YouTube videos, and they honestly help me to think about these things. I don't ever attack these things. I don't bring topics because I have something I need to say about them. I do have things that I want to say and want to communicate. I have things that I think are important, but this podcast is really about agreement, and it's about finding the wisdom in every line of thinking and in every guest that I have. So not only the guests, but also the viewers. So please do comment. Please get in touch with me through the comments if you want to add to this, because that will help me figure out who I'm going to talk to in the future. That'll maybe change the way I talk about things. So yeah, encourage you to do that. And I hope you enjoy this interview with Trevor Tchir. One more quick note before the interview begins. This was my last interview where I used my old video conferencing provider. The video wasn't as good as I would have liked, and the audio cuts out for a word here and there. I have switched to a much more rock-solid platform, so future videos will not have that issue. Thank you. Trevor Tchir, welcome to Morning Talk. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Being here. So I will admit, when I first reached out to you, it was because of an interaction we had on Facebook a long time ago, where I had just said, I was so curious about postmodernism, and I don't think that's going to be the focus of our talk today, but I just said on Facebook, does anyone actually identify themselves as a postmodernist? I'm sure you don't remember this, but
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
It was such a minimal thing. I was just like, because one of the things about that movement that I've thought about is that it's tricky. Like many people just wouldn't say they are. They might be postmodernist, but you said you were, and I don't know if that was facetious or if that was serious. But then the reason I reached out to you was because I saw you had basically gotten your PhD, and I thought, wow, what a perfect guy to talk to me about this philosophy, if indeed you are a postmodernist. So do you actually consider yourself to be a postmodernist?
I don't want to attach myself to the label of what I'm certainly intellectually and personally interested in the kind of in the postmodern critique of modernity. I think that how I understand postmodernism and how I understand modernism both have a lot of strong points going for them, for informed political perspectives. So, you know, to put it simply, count me as somewhere in between.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And I would say that I'm on the same spectrum, like I'm somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, because I like how you said the postmodernist critique, because my impression of postmodernism is that it is mainly a framework of critique. It's sort of giving yourself trying to give yourself the superpower of stepping aside from what might be the default narrative in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
To me, modernism contains, I don't know that this was ever intentional, but it seems like these days it is a very, very internalized and unquestioned kind of basic philosophy of kind of this, the modern person, you know. So I think postmodernism is absolutely necessary thing to have happen. I think both things, modernism and postmodernism, can go to
hilarious degree in which they're clearly not useful and aren't human anymore, you know?
Oh, yeah. I mean, modernism is almost too pervasive in how uh, us agents living within capitalist societies function and how we think. So it's tough sometimes, unless you spend your life being a kind of critical academic, to kind of gain a healthy critical scrutinizing purchase on the idea that us moderns are actually kind of historically constituted and we don't have to be living this way. And so postmodernism as a movement helps us critically assess how the Enlightenment shaped us, how colonialism and imperialism shape us, how capitalism shapes us, how liberal democracy shapes us, and then step back and say, you know, there are other alternatives and options, and like this isn't some kind of hard truth or one way of being. A lot gets concealed and along the way to producing us as subjects, and so yeah, you said postmodernism kind of had to happen, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. That there was sort of that in any kind of cultural or intellectual movement, there's going to be a reaction to it that questions it or
absolutely. So as a that there's a lack of empathy often in the way someone might view what they consider to be the opposite perspective from theirs. Like, I know there are people, I mentioned Jordan Peterson in my email to you, who are so afraid of postmodernism or so angry about it that they lose the ability to say happen. Like, they feel like they feel like anytime someone can be that different from them, that they must have chosen evil. You know what I mean? They've crossed the threshold. And it's always from, oh, they don't believe what they say they believe. They're just lazy or something like that. And I think that anything that has possessed enough people's mind, the number of people's minds and intellect, says postmodernism or modernism, came from a sense of felt need, I guess, from people, and then, like anything, can be taken too far.
I mean, a lot of people nowadays are very doctrinaire and publicly it seems that they're declaring that their way of seeing the world and their style of politics is the only true or valid way, and and I mean, part of postmodernism, I think one of its best parts is that it recognizes that for us to live together on planet Earth, given that we're all pretty unique and different, is that we're going to need to, at least to a certain extent, relativize our own notion of what makes a good life and what's true and valid.
Right.
I think that's a healthy perspective. It's a difficult one. I mean, it forces us to let go of some kind of ultimate ground that's going to rubber stamp and guarantee that the way we're living is right or true. But I think that although that's difficult, there's so much more dangerous in going around thinking it's our way or the highway. We're seeing this in U.S. politics and European politics and all sorts of politics, like this real polarization of camps. Right. I think part of this is a kind of fearful, a fear of recognizing that we as a person don't have ultimate guarantees to our ethical choices or our lifestyle choices, and that they're just as valid ways to live.
I think of it in terms of maybe it's a bit gruesome, but I think of like we should always kind of keep a little bit of an open wound. I don't know why I think of it that way, but we have this notion of strength, negotiating life from a position of strength. And
Mhm.
I think rather than having the ability to turn ourselves into these towers of strength, we just turn ourselves into these people who shut our weaknesses away. And so, uh, how shall I put it? You know, our blindness based on our perspective is one of our weaknesses. And so, to be able to almost feel the pain of that, feel the incompleteness of that, the incompleteness of our worldview because we can't have a sufficiently broad worldview to include other human beings. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I'm not, I won't force you to talk about postmodernism because once I kind of became more of what you're really doing, you are a political philosopher or political scientist. A whole new kind of set of questions and things that I thought it would be great to talk to you about in my head.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote my PhD and book on Hannah Arendt, who I consider to be a very important voice in postmodernism. She has a very sustained critique against of the Enlightenment and modernity that led to totalitarianism, and so I've always my background too. I've studied a lot of Kant and Hegel, big voices in modernity, big figures in modernity, and through my studying of Arendt, have become interested in that kind of postmodern critique of modernity. So I mean, I might spend more time on kind of how postmodernism and modernism plays out in political thought, rather than say taking deep dives into the philosophy, epistemology or other kind of branches of philosophy. But I mean, it's also interconnected.
Yeah. Yeah. So my first question I wanted to ask then, as a political scientist who is also a musician, I feel like you're someone who has probably thought quite a lot about the human condition. I consider myself, I shouldn't say I consider myself. I often say I'm not, which I'm sure you've heard many times from people, and I'm sure to someone with as deep a knowledge of politics as you, it's probably a pretty hilarious thing to say. Um,
Yeah, it depends on the use of the word political.
so,
What do you mean by it?
exactly. So rather than answer that, I want to ask you a question first. Um, how would you define political person or politics? And then, do you consider it to be something is sort of innate, or do you consider it to be a system that we kind of add in order to live together?
Well, I was teaching a political economy course on Thursday night. We're recording this on a Saturday morning, and it was to political economy course through at least three definitions of the political. And the first one would frame the political as only activities that occur in institutions of government, right? Parliaments, courts, the minister's office, right? So if something's even happening in the media, that doesn't count as political, right? Or in an interest group, doesn't count as political. You being an activist doesn't count as political because it's not in a government institution. I think that's too limited a view of what political is. All right. Another definition, which I'm more, I like better, is equates the political to activities occurring in the public sphere, rather than the private sphere. Although that's difficult division to define what's public, what's private. This changes at certain times in certain places. It means different things. But the public basically has to do with you as a private person, but that imply others, that are collective interests. Things like security, things like safe road, healthcare, which some people want to define as a private interest rather than a public interest. So I'd see a political person as someone who thinks about and acts on their opinion, their perspective about collective, about how collective interests, collective wants, collective needs ought to be met within their society, in deliberation with other citizens about how we want to live together as a community. And so that can mean getting really involved in more formal political institutions and activities like running for office in an election, or it can be less formally institutionalized examples of political activity like having conversations with people who aren't just your family members about the policies, regulations, policies, budgets that are being negotiated at any kind of level of government. Yeah. So
Okay.
that's already a long answer. So
No, that's good. One of the reasons I want to do these kinds of conversations is that people just don't get a chance to give a slightly longer answer often. And I think YouTube and podcasts have put these longer answers into the public space that you're talking about, which I think is so.
yeah, public space is largely digital space now and virtual space now, and that has all kinds of potential, and it has all kinds of weird external limitations to it as well. But
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I wanted to. This is almost me trying to exercise the demons of disconnection that take place, that come into your mind and your life through technology. So it's really great to talk to people and get informed opinions. So yeah, the definitions of politics and the word political that you gave, I think the one, politics is what happens in the offices of prime ministers and elected officials and that kind of thing. That's the one that feels like a terribly large gap bridge,
yeah,
and we really get our silver bullet is our vote, and you send that towards the target you think would be good, and then you sit back and see what happens. So, what I'm not going to do is kind of get you to prescription for politics, but I am interested in collective versus the individual, like you said, because it seems as though the collective versus the individual is at the heart of the political discussion nowadays. Like it's sort of, I mean, I don't want to present a simplistic view of either side, but it seems like one of the values of the conservative right is that individual rights and freedoms, individual ability to protect themselves, private ownership, and all of that. And then on the left, the further you get, the more it's like maybe a collective. We're all in this together. We should share because there's enough for everyone. And I guess just like modernism and postmodernism, we definitely have to live in the middle ground. And so I'm not sure if there's a question here exactly, but I like what you're saying, and I see a corollary um, between our need for self-determination and our need for collective, uh, just to be a part of a collective. Um, and
This is one of the kind of perennial challenges of politics, is trying to find the middle ground between the freedom for the individual to set and then pursue their own goals in relation to their own conception of the good life, and fulfilling duties that they owe the community, or finding harmony among their community, feeling at home in the world, that they do live in a shared world with others, and that they do owe certain things to other members of their community. And this was the kind of dichotomy set up by Aristotle in ancient Greece, by Rousseau and Hegel in modern times, and it's still one of the main ways that we see the kind of perennial problems or challenges of political challenges that human beings face.
Absolutely. I wonder if you
and different political parties and perspectives have different answers to that problem.
I wonder if maybe you can speak to this.
Sure.
Issue with politics and with the polarization of politics has to do with how much, or how we've lost some of the ways that maybe we used to be together, physically together, in the world. Some of the meeting spaces that were actually separate from politics. I wonder if you have any insights into how people can be together, or like if people are required to be at a political rally to be, that's problematic.
Well, they're already among people who sort of share the same doxa, the same opinion as them. So there's not any reaching out to the other side yet. Political rally.
Right. So have you, in your investigations of sort of political history, what have been the best institutions and ways, like meeting places for people to actually just live life together so that they can't demonize?
Yeah, bowling. And I say that tongue in cheek because think of the movie Bowling for Columbine. Michael
Moore.
Michael Moore, thank you. Michael Moore didn't choose bowling arbitrarily. It's because there's an old political scientist, Putnam, who talks about bowling as an example of how Americans used to, from all political stripes, used to get together and spend time with one another and build social capital. And he saw opportunities for this meeting together in sort of not really political spaces per se, not formal institutions of politics. It's not parliament, but these kind of social spaces where people can more or less casually get to know each other, see each other, share their opinions on their community, and feel a kind of connection and belonging with one another, even though they different perspectives, different opinions about shared events within their community. And this is like the fact that we spend more time atomized at our work desks and in our private homes, and that we're only connected digitally and through our handheld devices.
Yeah.
We'll call them. This is part of the problem, I think. I mean, there's so much in the internet for connecting people digitally that otherwise would never get to meet, right? Because of how huge the world is, right? So in some way, internet and digital media has brought these connections, like they're more possible over long distances, and that's great.
Right. Yeah.
But it also seems that people who are pretty close to one another spatially in the same community don't tend to meet up together in as much in physical space. And I might call me old-fashioned, but I think that's important for people of different interests and different political persuasions to still realize that it's good they be able to live together constructively, ethically, with respect, and be neighbors. Yeah.
That maybe it's old-fashioned, but I think it's a very, very deep human need.
Yeah, it's also easier to vilify people that you don't agree with politically if you're never meeting with them face to face.
One of the things,
if you need to meet with them face to face, I think it's less likely that people will kind of hide behind their computer screen or their Facebook avatar and say, and I'm not that, but essentially vilify their political opponent.
Something I would add in and see what your impression is, because I fully agree, like the disconnection thing. It's one of the reasons I like to do these things face to face, even though there's technical limitations and things like that. But, so I'll bounce something off you and see if you agree or disagree. What happens when the public space moved to Facebook, largely, that wasn't necessarily, in my view, it didn't have to be a negative thing, but then the fact that the algorithms began to really curate what you saw based on your own activity, and so this is something that's been discussed a lot, but they curate what you see based on your own activity. It kind of makes me feel like part of that phenomena actually added in a little subcurrent of self-hatred, because everyone from all walks of life acknowledge the negative aspect of that technology, and we're still there, and we still fall prey to it. You know what I mean? So, and actually, that ties into the hatred of capitalism. I believe that capitalism has algorithms, and by the way, I should say I'm not specifically anti-capitalism, but that what happens in capitalism is that some kind of non-digital algorithms get into things because, you know, what's done in business or what's done in industry reflects where people actually put their money, where individuals put their money. And so I feel like the critique of capitalism sometimes contains a bit of self-loathing as well, because we don't like the fact that when given purchasing freedom, we don't make the choices that make organic foods cheap. We don't make the choices that don't pollute the world. You know what I mean? Like, and then when that thing that we can feel in that situation, we don't like that, so we can turn it into a powerful, project out a powerful evil onto others. Does that make any sense? Does that resonate with you, or does it?
Yeah. Another thing that that I think I find frustrating, being an agent within capitalism, and I don't think I'm alone, is that I catch myself buying things that I don't want, that I certainly don't need, but that I probably don't even really want, but that I'm kind of, capitalism and the products out there, they're not actually just satisfying needs, they're creating wants, because companies have figured out that they can sell a product if their advertising is good enough to create that want. This isn't a new idea. I mean, Karl Marx was pretty good theorizer of showing how capitalism creates creates false wants. And,
It has to when it grows to a certain point. You know what I mean? Like if there was a sort of capitalist rural village where all of the, this is just I'm just going off the top of my head, but if all of the needs were being provided by a person, and maybe, a person who's new to the job market might say, well, what are the actual needs of the community, or what do people like? When it's small, I feel like it could maybe be a good way to provide needs, but if it gets big enough, there's no way it can't start um, creating needs for people and then fulfilling them, unless we, on some spiritual level, value not that. Unless, maybe does that make sense?
well, the way the system is set up, which is this the profit motive, and the reinvestment of surplus, enough. I mean, one of the kind of principles of capitalism is a sort of imperative to grow the economy more, to always increase GDP, and so built into it is this hubris that never enough. That we're constantly searching for new markets.
Right. And that, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the interesting things that Arendt writes about pretty intelligently in her class in 58 is
Oh, I'm sorry, can you say that one more time? Your audio cut out.
Yeah, Arendt writes about this phenomenon in her 1958 book, The Human Condition, which a lot of people have read, and it's kind of making a little bit of a comeback the last 10 years or so. In a chapter that she describes as the rise of the social, she has some interesting things to say about capitalism. I won't get into too many details about it now. I don't want to get us all, too much in the weeds. But she shows the kind of parallel between the principles of capitalism and the guiding principles of the metabolism of nature. Like once we see society in terms of a nation and treat it like a household whose main is to provide material needs and then come up with a surplus. Once we conceive the nation as in terms that you would usually reserve for family, then just as in a biological family, there's this imperative to produce and reproduce, and when we apply this principle to society as a whole, we adopt this kind of perspective that there's not any kind of rational limit to how much wealth ought to be accumulated for a given society, a national economy. And we begin to produce, not to kind of fulfill our actual needs and to create a world where we feel at home, but rather we just produce to consume. We produce to consume. That's where we get this kind of mass consumption and disposable society from.
Right.
We need to be able to dispose things and make them cheaply in order to produce more, to consume more, as though it's like this biological thing that is growing just like an animal or plant. Or anyway, I'm kind of glossing on it. And
it's very interesting. So what comes to my mind when you say this, and we talk about it needs to grow, that when you create this produce to consume, it has the feeling of a runaway train kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And the limiter on that, like the only fail safe or whatever, it seems to be, in my mind,
Yeah.
to create, or not to create, but to actually inspire people to value each other and value the future, in a way that is spiritual in mind, in a way that it doesn't feel like a government can supply, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Like
Well,
the
that's important.
actual fail safe against, well, any political system going awry is something on the level of spirit. Um, uh, so maybe respond to that. Do you have a thought, answer?
Sure. Well, in liberal democratic societies that are fashioned around this, I think, important separation of church and state, one of the constitutional imperatives is that the state doesn't get involved too much in spirit, doesn't get too much in, doesn't get involved in sanctioning one religion. All right, like religious freedom is a very important right to modern liberal democratic societies. So in that respect, our governing institutions need to leave spiritual development and formation of the citizens almost to the private sphere or to the social sphere. Um, at the same time, it's governments that design public curriculum. So I'm not talking about prescribing religion, but just teaching our kids good ethical values. If you mean spirit in that sense, then yeah, our states are still very, very much involved in teaching spirit, teaching virtues, uh, and it's a matter now of kind of having a tough discussion as a community. Which virtues do we want to teach
Right. Yeah.
children in public school systems?
Yeah. How extreme or how far into the ethical and moral world does the educational system go? And
Yeah, I mean, in Ontario, the public sex ed system's trying to teach about consent. And our premier right now is trying to roll back that sex ed curriculum. I mean, he said he'd roll it back, and essentially they've passed legislation saying that families can opt out of sex ed education. But to teach consent, that seems like a virtue you'd be teaching your children, and it's a very sticky conversation about what kind of
yeah.
virtues or ethics the state is going.
Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Sorry, which ethical questions the state's going to teach about the school system.
Right.
Ones are going to be left to the private households to kind of.
I mean, and it doesn't get more intimate. Like, I'm not going to try to avoid stating political views as much as possible. So I don't mean to dodge the consent thing at all, but just to say there is nothing more intimate than sexual relations and sexual politics, and so yeah, that really hits at the core of people. I wonder if there's any value in how would I put it? So the separation of church and state is very important. I believe it is, and I wonder if maybe in this time, if there's a way to encourage sort of not non-religious, but like some kind of moral institutions. I don't know. It's very difficult because I feel like by the time it gets to over ethics and morals in the public sphere, in the educational system, feels like it's, especially because it's our children, it feels like it's too late to have a nuanced conversation. or something like that. So I guess I'm yearning for. See, I came up in a church background, and I have seen firsthand the pitfalls and the echo chambers that can happen, and I've also seen firsthand the community focus and the the real help for fellow man that can happen. The 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 breadth of things that can happen through these non-governmental moral institutions.
Yeah.
The gap is unbelievably wide because you'd have to throw in, white supremacy groups into that same category, or you'd have to throw in like because they're non-governmental groups of organized people working with some kind of uh,
Are you talking about like faith groups and like religious groups, or just any kind of community group as an ethical stance?
I'm speaking of community groups with an ethical stance, but with the caveat that my experience growing up was in a faith-based group. So I guess I kind of wonder if to some of the polarization and maybe the way that some of these conversations about curriculum and that kind of thing could be improved is something that is not within the power of government to do, but it's in as many of the cultural and community-based groups as possible, attempting to politicize themselves as much as to not align, to not openly and overtly align themselves with specific political parties, and to not screen their membership by those
Yeah.
means or anything, even socially. But I mean, that's one of the reasons I end up saying I'm not political, is because I think if you look at people entering the arena, what you want is people entering that arena who love themselves, love others, and really want to live together. And it
Yeah.
seems to me like a lot of the institutions, churches included, creating politically, ideologues, strict and harsh ideologues who are
Yeah.
entering the political arena with their boxing gloves on.
Yeah, it's very tribalism is one of the terms you hear nowadays. That in the sense of people kind of staying within their own divided groups and as treating life and like like a team sport, and they can't wear two jerseys at once. One of the other things that I agree with you, but one of the other things that I think these groups, as well as the media, could vocalize a bit stronger is just that we need to recognize ethical limits to our actions. For so long, this harkens back to one of the principles of modernity. Speaking of modernity, modernity has this principle where the old Greek sense of hubris, the old Greek sense of it's a bad thing if you kind of bypass natural limits. You're committing hubris if you bypass natural limits to human action. If you bypass or break through rational limits to human action, there's going to be negative things that occur. Modernity kind of says, you know what? Forget you Greeks. The modern agent is all about exploding those so-called cultural limits. Establishing new frontiers, new values, even, and capitalism's imperialism. It's all tied into that notion of the modern man being a kind of exploder of limits, and with the climate crisis, with huge economic disparity, and all sorts of other social problems, I think that just the discourse of limits, rational limits to our fossil fuel consumption, mind than it tends to be in everyday kind of media discourse, political discourse. And I think that this is something that the right and the left, they have in common, a kind of respect for limits, but they're having trouble speaking to each other. They have kind of more in common than they think.
I agree, actually. And it's interesting that, yeah, I like the this thing you're saying. It me like there's always lip service to humility, but actually somehow baking humility in to large systems becomes very difficult because it's very strange when, like, say in the U.S., we want people to be humble, and yet we have individuals at the height of power. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if that ties in well.
The sound just cut out for the word power.
Okay. Sorry. You have individuals at the height power.
Individuals, yeah, yeah.
That is. I feel like there's always going to be tension there. I mean, I'm just speaking off the cuff. I actually don't know what my politics are at this point in my life. I'm at this point of kind of radical openness, where I really want to understand things rather than form hard opinions. But yeah, to say that we all need to be humble, then to exalt, a very small number of people up at the heights of power over us is a mixed message. It's just something that kind of came into my mind as you were talking.
Yeah.
A response to that?
Not
that's okay.
You think that there's a between being humble and not wanting to commit hubris and to recognize limits, and that a tension between that and the notion that we kind of idolize an elite set of individuals that have a lot of political power. What you're saying? Because
we reward hubris.
Reward hubris. Oh yeah, yeah.
I guess that's the way to phrase it. Sorry, it's not a well-formed thought, but that was just kind of what came to my mind when you were talking.
Well, I think that that we can recognize limits and still reward merit and wisdom in sort of recognizing the authority to take up pretty important public. Like, I think that we can still recognize limits and make rational, good, ethical decisions, and still elect people to public offices where they're going to have, as an individual, a lot of power. But I think that by recognizing that we need to have limits as a community and that they should be based on rational deliberation, that we would choose these individuals that are going to have a lot of political power based on their exhibiting that they can understand these limits and be responsible as leaders, and that we're not just electing people that we find fascinating because they're celebrities or because they're kind of that they don't recognize limits. I mean, I think Trump's popular in a way because he doesn't give two hoots about certain limits.
Right. Well, what comes to my mind as you're saying that is kind of the way that maybe the Trump phenomenon and various things in modern times have flipped the script. Because if I were to hear you talk about limits like that, personal limits and all of that.
Yeah, spending limits.
If I were to hear you talk about that without specific reference to Trump, I would say that it almost sounded conservative. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying
I agree it's small c conservative in terms of like conserve the world that we're trying to live in, conserve the environment, conserve the future for our kids, but conservative parties, Republican parties, have principles and individuals that are not small c conservative at all. They lead to very kind of very individualist, very liberal attitudes, depending on the topic, on the right that you're focusing on, depending on the, you know.
Yeah.
That's why I think right and left, they tend to cloud and confuse debates more than be helpful sometimes.
Absolutely. And I hope you don't take, oh, sorry, you cut out. Did I interrupt you?
Nope.
Okay. I hope you don't take me saying that you were sounding conservative as a negative thing.
No.
I have a, a suspicion that conservative and liberal are more like personality types that will always exist, and that it's quite possible that people who are flag or with a conservative official name aren't being conservative in a human way, being conservative in being true to the conservative personality type of wanting to protect what we have, protect what's working, which is a good thing. I see the liberal conservative divide as being something that can be so healthy with certain people looking to the future, certain people protecting the present, and a dialogue, between the two. And so I think you're absolutely right when you say that conservatives and liberals don't have as much, aren't as different as they might think.
Well, those are two very broad categories. They're large tent. In Canada and the United States, there are parties attached with those political camps, and these are huge brokerage parties that try to bring together voters with quite different opinions within those different camps. And so, I think when you ask someone, "Are you liberal?" to take another step and ask them, like, on what level are you talking? In terms of the economic question of how much the government should intervene in the economy, like fiscally, or we talk about social issues, and even then, which social issues?
Right.
That are, say, they really believe in individual right choice, like the right to bear arms, right? The right to pray in school, right? But then they won't say the right to access to abortion. So you can't just say that it's about individual rights. It depends on the question. And I think that when we just kind of divide up into these camps and say we think like a conservative or we think like a liberal, it doesn't take the kind of time or care to parse out how members from these two different camps actually issues in the particular expression of how individual rights play.
So it seems to me, that maybe what I'm hearing from you is that we've replaced what could be personality types that are a framework for action in the world, or a framework even for wisdom and discernment in the world, have been replaced with dogmas, have been replaced with strict ideologies. And actually, if I were to bring it full circle, I would maybe throw in there that postmodernism is when it's characterized in a healthy way, or when it's lived out in a healthy way, is merely the acknowledgement that you might be a part of a dogma or a grand narrative that has possessed you, and that it's gone too far. That that you can, that even just to acknowledge that there might be another story or another way to read. Another way to read things, or that other people's experience and other people's stories that they feel they're in are really where they're at, and that might be that that little bit of postmodernism for everybody could be
Right.
it could be a healthy thing.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And another aspect of postmodernism, I think that's healthy, is that we're not like our identity, who we are, is not determined by some essential personality or by one essential or most important affiliation to one, but our identity is fragmented, and our identity is constructed by what we say and what we do in our changing situation across our whole life biography.
Right.
And it's not done until we are done.
Right.
And that's a lot of pressure off of us then, if we see identity this way, from kind of figuring out exactly what camp we're going to embrace.
We're not so
or is
finite.
it going to embrace us. And we don't need to kind of expect particular behaviors from others, or stereotype others, because we think that we can kind of figure out who they are just by looking at them.
Yeah. It's something
That's one of the nice things about postmodernism. It's kind of like deconstructing this notion of an essentialist identity.
right. And I agree. I agree with you. To put a couple of my cards on the table, I guess I couldn't call myself a social constructionist, and I don't know what you feel about that, but I very much value the postmodern idea that we don't have complete control over who we are and how we are, and that acknowledging that is actually the only way to begin to have a little bit of, if we're composing the symphony of our life or whatever, acknowledging that some of that symphony has been written, by someone else or by other things, is paradoxically the only way that we can maybe take up a pen and start to put some notes in there, right? It's not. I don't necessarily think there's no inherent self, but I think that we need to see ourselves as uncovering ourselves and discovering ourselves, but also being defined. It's a very dynamic thing. That you're right. It never ends. It never ends. And one of the things that I've noticed ideologies tend to do and dogmas tend to do is tell you, you are free in your mind. You have total control over yourself. But here's the conclusion you must reach. However you want to get there, that's your thing. So then all of life kind of just becomes this way of almost aesthetically framing what we feel we have to believe, rather than realizing that some of it, was dictated to us, and some of it needs to be questioned. I don't think we'll have the best conservatives possible or the best liberals possible, the best Marxists possible, as long as we don't have that ability to question not just the conclusions we think we want to make and to revise our final goal, but also to revise our methods, revise our means as we go along.
Yeah.
And so that can obviously be very difficult from a political standpoint. Because we're not, I don't know. It seems like politics is not set up for evolution, but maybe it is. I'm ranting now. I apologize. I went off there. The things you're saying are...
No, I don't mean, in terms of your rant. You say a lot of intelligent things there, I think. To respond to a couple of them, I don't think that recognizing that the self is fragmentary and that that should forego a sense of individual responsibility for our actions.
I didn't think
even if we don't have ultimate control over who we are, we still need to take responsibility for how we act. It's still going to be, our actions, our choices are still going to be attached to us. Another thing I'll respond to is that you said you don't think politics are kind of set up for evolution. What do you mean by that?
it was a little bit off the cuff. I was just thinking, I guess what I mean is like I don't see I don't see a lot of how would I put it? Almost like, well, I don't see a lot of evolution in politics when things swing in when things swing back and forth. So we get, you know, an NDP government in Alberta, and they don't have time. You know,
Right.
they don't have time to stretch out. They
Yeah.
you know and do things at an actual at the pace of human change or human growth, like, which is a fairly slow thing, right? It's like
Mhm.
get it yourself, and then conservatives get in and prove yourself, you know, and then we swing back and forth. It seems
Yeah.
very e- evolutionary, you know,
Right.
if you look at it from real evolution or survival of the fittest, if there is a super predator, um, over you know, one animal that's a super predator over another animal, then that there's not going to be an ecosystem. You know, if those are the two constituents, there's not going to be an ecosystem. There's going to be um, wiping out of species. You know, so politics almost seems, instead of evolving where both have their methods. You know, it seems like there's the winner and then another winner and then another winner. Does this make sense? Maybe I'll let you respond and see if you have something more cogent to say than what I'm ranting about.
Well, what I'm taking from what you're saying is sort of a function of our electoral system, that we have these elections every 4 or 5 years to try to make policy changes, but also make changes that are going to set them up to win the next election. And that's a problem with our democracy. And why some parties win elections and lose elections, it's not always because they don't make good policies. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, though. And so, you know, one of the arguments against democracy, that it might be useful to have sort of an aristocratic type regime where you have kind of the wisest policymakers who don't need to get elected in there deliberating to try to make the most progressive policy changes possible. Of course, there's all sorts of problems with that, and that's that the public doesn't have proper channels by which to feed that partake in that deliberation. So it's imperfect.
And it would be very difficult for them to properly value opposing voices, you know.
Another thing I'll say about politics isn't evolutionary. One of the things about postmodernism, as you know, is that it throws out this notion that we're all evolving or progressing to one end state,
right?
The end of history. However, I don't think that postmodernism is trying to throw out the window that we can make rational decisions that make improvements. And I want to stress, make life better for people without believing in a kind of teleological, progressive, linear notion of history that only has one possible course. And I think we can't throw responsibility away to make good decisions that are going to positively affect everyone involved and positively affect the world that we're trying to leave behind.
Right. Well, I certainly agree that, yeah, like a healthy postmodernism would still involve responsibility for our actions and rational decision making. I think that the danger for modernism or postmodernism is just in limiting our ability to question.
Yeah, and one of the challenges is that when you have so many different political opinions, political voices, it's difficult to sift through all those fairly and to come up with a procedure that rationally determines what's the best option, what's the best policy option, what's the best decision. You know, this is kind of the purview of someone like a Habermas. And I think that that's one of the reasons that some people get it's one of the reasons why you have a kind of reaction sometimes to immigration, right? What it is it's people finding it very, very difficult to come to terms with this challenge of incorporating all sorts of different perspectives and outlooks when figuring out how to make positive changes for their community, right? That's one of the reasons. It's just very, very difficult to consider all different sorts of ethical, and I want to make it clear, I'm a huge proponent of immigration in my community in Canada. I think that it's just a question of human rights as well. The relatively free mobility of human beings across borders. But also I think that having different perspectives is very healthy for community debate. It doesn't make it any easier though, that challenge of figuring out a fair way to listen to all perspectives and then figuring out a procedure by which the best policy is produced. That's tough. That's politics.
Yeah. It seems to me like I must applaud the fact that you've kind of devoted your life and your career to getting students to think these things through.
Thanks. I don't pretend to have any answers, but I like thinking about the problems a lot.
No,
They're challenging.
that's good. I mean, solutions, crowdsourced solutions based on more and more people thinking deeply rather than thinking, tribally or thinking, in a limited dogmatic way. More and more people. So doing that is the way forward. So my hat's off to you. I've really appreciated this conversation. A lot of insights from you, and I hope I didn't rant too much. The things that you say were stimulating thoughts in my head.
Thanks a lot, Aaron. Thanks for having me as part of this podcast, and I look forward to hearing more of these talks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate it, and it's the pleasure is all mine. So I guess now I'll stop the recording, and I will be in touch in the future.